If you use Permablend pigments, pay attention. In the last few days, many of us cosmetic tattoo artists are learning that Permablend line was banned in France by the ANSM, and they were banned because there was bacillus found in several lots that were tested of their Luxe range, which is supposed to be the European Union REACH compliant version of Permablend pigments. If you are currently using Permablend pigments, especially the Luxe line in Vivid Coral, make sure you discontinue use and let your distributor know, especially if you have any pigments that you want to return or you are concerned may have been contaminated and caused a reaction to clients, because it is believed that there is widespread bacillus contamination in the Permablend bottles. But let's talk about that and understand more about not only the ANSM, who they are, what is EU REACH compliance, and how often does bacillus contaminate the manufacturing process, especially with permanent makeup pigments? First of all, if you have no idea what REACH is, you're probably in the USA, because REACH is going to be a compliance organization that has started in 2007 and is now really taken effect in 2002. And they are regulating the European Union, and there's also a different type of REACH regulation in the UK, now that the UK has left the EU, that lets manufacturers specifically of chemical compounds like pigment know how they need to manufacture their pigments without any carcinogens or contaminants that may cause cell mutation, may cause allergic reactions that are known. And that's going to be now over 30,000 known compounds that can no longer be used in tattoo pigments in the European Union, according to REACH. What this meant for Permablend is that their range, being not REACH compliant, they had to create a brand new range called Luxe. And that is the line called into question with this Permablend ban coming out of France due to the bacillus contamination that is believed to be widespread throughout the bottles. Now, REACH really believes in making sure that the products that we use during the tattoo process, not just pigments, but all of the products, are very heavily tested. And that's because when we are tattooing, we're not just introducing pigment to the skin and, it just dies there and nothing happens forever and ever, amen. No. When we implant pigment into the skin, we are implanting it into a living organ where cells are going to pick up that pigment and trap it there where it can no longer move and be held in our skin for years to come. So if those inks have toxins, if those inks are contaminated, what is going to happen? What are the long-term side effects, and what happens when the client gets an infection? As these pigments are excreted throughout the skin during the healing process, they're picked up by our bloodstream and our lymphatic system and sent out through the lymph cells and lymph nodes. So that's why contamination is very important to be understood and to be tracked, because obviously if there is contaminated pigment out in the world, the whole point of REACH is to eliminate the sale of it so that unsuspecting clients and artists are not exposed to it during the tattoo process. Now, the reason why a lot of these colors are going to be affected is because the vibrant blues, greens, pinks, all of these really bright colors that we use may have some sort of carcinogen or toxin in them because they're coming from an organic source from the ground. And as we know, there's a lot of environmental causes of contamination: lead, cadmium, mercury, all kinds of different contamination that we can get from sources like rocks in the ground, soil, and that's truly where a lot of our pigment comes from. For instance, black ink is a PAH. It is literally made from petroleum oil in the ground, and it's a byproduct of that petroleum oil that's burnt off. So it does contain some benzopyrene, which is a carcinogen labeled by known cancer organizations. So that's why this testing and REACH compliance is so important of our tattoo pigments, because obviously if you're not buying from a reputable source and somebody that doesn't care about your health, well-being, and safety, then you may very well be buying a pigment brand or a product that is going to harm you or your clients. And you may be thinking to yourself, I've never heard of this before. I've never heard of a risk of cancer from a tattoo complications, but it is known that tattoo pigments that have a high concentration of metals in them can actually burn you, especially during an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, if that area of the MRI is focused on the area where you have your tattoo, and especially if it has red pigment, which is known to be more irritated by the MRI machine during the scan due to the metal, the metallic in the pigment. Now, if you're in the United States and you're saying to yourself, again, I've never heard of REACH, I don't understand why this is so important, that's because just in general in the USA, yes, we have the Food and Drug Administration, but they don't actually test our pigments. They don't test a lot of the products that we use, not our face creams, not our deodorants, nothing with a scent or a fragrance or color in it. They don't test anything. They just let us use it and figure out after the fact if it's bad. And then when we figure out it's bad, they ban it from us. So the FDA actually does randomly test products to check for safety to see if they need to take it off the market, especially when they get complaints. And between 2003 and 2021, they actually have seen some voluntary tattoo ink recalls based on manufacturers themselves finding sources of contamination during the manufacturing process. When contamination is found during testing, it's always done on unsealed bottles that are bought usually from the same lot number so that they can actually test if it's a problem within that whole line or if it's just a one-off problem from maybe just somebody in the factory missing something that day. Who knows? It's when you manufacture a product and it's on a production line, there are a whole host of things that can happen and can be missed during quality control check, but that's also why you should, on the manufacturing line, have your own sources of quality control check. But when they found contamination, they really did not find large parts per million, large amounts of contamination, but the concern is any amount of contamination is concerning, especially when bacteria multiply over time and once it encounters the client's skin, especially if they're immune compromised. Most commonly, the bacteria contaminant found was, you guessed it, Bacillus, because it is a very common environmental bacteria and it does create spores. Spores are little shells that a bacteria can create around itself and dehydrate, dry out, and just wait for that opportunity to rehydrate, reanimate, and come back to life and reinfect you, which is what makes a spore forming or spore producing bacteria so harmful. Now, usually the reasons for these bottles being contaminated is there's no real proof of sterilization history, or maybe sterilization wasn't properly documented or performed. And that is one of the concerns in this ANSM complaint from France for Permablend, is they don't believe these bottles have been properly sterilized, which is why the bacillus contamination has been found. And while it is interesting in this complaint that all of the pigment bottles that are named are specifically Permablend, I wouldn't doubt that right now the ANSM is very closely looking at all pigment brands, trying to identify if there are other sources of contamination on the market, not just specifically targeting Permablend, but right now, obviously, that's why we're paying attention to this situation. And something that I think is important to mention is just because you were using a contaminated bottle of pigment with bacillus, that doesn't necessarily mean that your client will become infected. Again, it matters the amount of the bacteria concentration in the pigment. It matters the amount that reaches the client. It matters the health of the client. There's so many other factors that will impact whether or not your client gets an infection from this type of contamination, not just if the product is contaminated in general. And again, I don't think this problem is specifically isolated to Permablend, as in a 2018 survey, the USDA FDA actually did find that almost half of the unopened tattoo and PMU pigment inks that they purchased during this survey timeframe were usually contaminated in some capacity. So again, there's a many variety of reasons. Were they not sterilized properly? Was there some sort of contamination inside the factory? Who knows? But obviously this is not just isolated to one brand. Now, one thing that I did find interesting in Permablend's response to this report from the ANSM about banning the use of Permablend products due to contamination for the near future is that they stated that France has stricter EU REACH regulatory testing requirement and criteria than other EU REACH compliant regulatory countries. But that being said, as a product manufacturer myself, you really should work according to the strictest testing and quality and safety standards of the most rigorous country in order to make sure that you don't fail compliance anyway. So that was very interesting. But stay tuned, guys. There's definitely going to be more on this.